Hi everyone, my name is Tim Franklin and I'm a professor in the John M. Mutz Chair in Local News here at Medill, and I'm with my great colleague Zach Metzger, who's the director of the Medill State and Local News Project. And just a few hours ago we released our 2025 annual State and Local News Report, which takes a look at the landscape of local news across the country and what's happening in the local news industry. So Zach, why don't we start off just by talking a little bit about how this report comes together, and talk a little bit about the research team behind it.
Sure. So we have a really fantastic research team here. We have two full-time researchers, John Volk and Srishti Bose, who assist in a lot of the research, a lot of the data collection. We also have a really wonderful team of undergraduate student researchers that do a lot of the data collection, a lot of the data cleaning and processing. And it is a monumental work every year to sort through all of the data that comes to us from a lot of different sources. We are combining data from each of the 50 state press associations, from membership associations, from government sources, from NPR and from PBS and CPB. So just a tremendous amount of data in a lot of different formats that's all coming together. And we do that every year so that we can have a kind of historical look, that we can say, here's how the news landscape has changed and evolved over time. Here are the places that are underserved by local news. Here are the places where there's a lot of local news, but what is that local news looking like, and how is it reaching people? And so we want to be able to tell that story over time so that we can understand the dynamics and the changes within the industry, and then help people, whether they're philanthropists, whether they're industry figures, whether they're policymakers, understand where are resources needed, how can we best allocate resources, and what can we be doing to support the ecosystem of local news. And
let's talk about the database. What's in the database?
So we have data on a variety of news outlets beyond just newspapers. When this project first started, it was focused on newspapers. And
started 20 years ago.
Started 20 years ago. And since then, we have expanded that data significantly to look at other media types, to bring in data on digital sites, both standalone and as part of larger network organizations, ethnic media and foreign language media, and public broadcasting. The landscape of local news is vast and it is varied. We have some data on around 5,500 newspapers, a little bit more than 600 standalone digital news sites, a little bit more than 800 network digital news sites, about 700 ethnic media outlets, and around 300 to 400 public broadcasters.
So one of the great advantages of having data going back 20 years is that it gives us a chance to really see this transformational change that's going on in the local news industry. And of course it's happening not just in local news, but all types of media at this point. But talk a little bit about some of the big changes that you've seen, or that we see in the data over 20 years.
So it's been a landscape that has dramatically transformed. And one of the key aspects of that transformation, elements of that transformation, has been really one of access, about who has access to local news and who doesn't. And as we've said multiple times, the gulf between the news haves and the news have-nots is continuing to widen in America. 20 years ago, there were around 3 newspapers for every 100,000 people. And today that number's been cut in half. It's a little more than 1.5. 20 years ago, there were around 37 million Americans who lived with limited access to local news, living in a county with either one source or no source. And today that number's gone up to 50 million. There's around 210, a little bit more than 210 counties with no locally based news source present, and around 1,500 counties with only one remaining, usually a smaller weekly newspaper. So over the last 20 years, we've seen a tremendous contraction within local news. We've seen a lot of consolidation within local news. And that has played out with really diminished access for a lot of people to this resource.
Yeah, so absolutely. So let's talk about the findings from this year's report a little bit and then dive into those deeply. So we've seen an increase in news deserts across the country. Last year in the report it was 206. This year it's 213. These are entire counties with no locally based local news. There were 136 closures or mergers of newspapers last year. That was up from 130 in the previous year. And there's also, we found an interesting new wrinkle in those closures over the course of the past year. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so when we look over the past 20 years and we see more than 1 in every 3 newspapers disappearing, that's a tremendous amount of papers that have vanished. The main driver behind those disappearances have been mass closures and mass mergers, mass consolidation carried out by large chain owners, predominantly in urban areas and in the suburbs of large cities. Mm-hmm. But this year was a little bit different. This year, the majority of papers that closed or merged were either smaller, family-run independent outlets or parts of smaller chains. We didn't really see the kinds of mass closures and mass mergers that were present even last year. And that points to something interesting and also something slightly troubling, that even without this major driver of closures that we've seen over the past 2 decades, the rate of newspaper closures still remained roughly the same, around 2 a week. And so that is indicative of perhaps financial headwinds that smaller independent family-run outlets are facing. That can be indicative of a trend perhaps among family-run outlets that it's time to get out of the news business. It's perhaps a little too early to say where this trend will lead. But it's a troubling and also slightly different development that I think is one of the most surprising aspects of this year's report.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's important because these local, often family-run local newspapers have been in the same hands for decades. These are folks who live in the community, who know the community, know its history, know the people, they know the context. So when these owners go away, it's really more than just the loss of any other local business. It's the loss of a lot of institutional knowledge and history about that community.
Absolutely. You know, something that I often think about is in a lot of towns, the local newspaper is the oldest continuously operating business still active in that town.
Yeah.
So it is the archive of institutional memory. It's part of the cultural identity of that place, of how it sees itself. And it's a really profound thing to lose.
That sure is. Let's talk about another kind of focal point of this year's report. We spent a lot of time researching public broadcasting, and we did that in part because the federal government, as we sit here today, a few months back, rescinded more than $1 billion in funding for public broadcasting. So what did we find in looking at the public broadcasting landscape, and what does this defunding of public broadcasting mean for local news deserts and for local news generally?
Sure. So public broadcasting plays a really interesting role in the local news ecosystem, because when we look beyond newspapers, when we look at digital news sites, those often tend to be pretty heavily concentrated in urban areas. But public broadcasting isn't in the same way. It is spread out across the country. It reaches into rural areas. It reaches into less affluent areas. It's present in all parts of the United States. And so it plays a really important role in bringing local news to a lot of rural communities, but it's also infrastructurally prominent in its distribution network to be able to bring news to a lot of these areas. When we looked at the signal contours for public radio, for example, we found that more than 80% of news desert counties receive a signal from a public radio station. Now, that doesn't mean that that signal is carrying local news unique to that county, but it does mean that the infrastructure to do so is there. And NPR in particular has been building up regional networks to try to capitalize on this infrastructure in recent years, to be able to share resources, share reporting, and bring reporters to the places where they're most needed. Now, the recent rescissions, as you mentioned, have complicated this mission a little bit. As you mentioned, about $1 billion have been rescinded from CPB that would have gone to
Corporation
NPR,
for Public Broadcasting.
Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that would have gone to NPR, National Public Radio, and PBS, Public Broadcasting Service stations. Now, that's going to look pretty different depending on where those stations are located and what their operating budgets are. Some of the stations in more affluent areas or more urban areas, they rely on federal funding, perhaps slightly less. They'll still be affected, but they might be able to make up that loss in other sources. The stations that are in more rural parts of the country or in less affluent parts of the country, these stations rely on a much more substantial part of their operating budget coming from the federal government. And so these are ones that are potentially losing more than 40, 50% of their budget overnight, and are going to be facing a much more uphill battle in making up for that with donations.
So we said in the report that 10% of public broadcasters get 40% or more of their funding from the federal government, and that in 9 counties, public radio is the last remaining local news source. So if those go away, the news desert problem gets worse.
Right, it's sort of a dual challenge because the places where public radio is perhaps most important, certainly it's important everywhere, but perhaps where it's most important are these smaller rural communities where there aren't many alternative news sources. If a public radio station in the middle of a large city went away, that would be a blow. But if a public radio station in a rural community in northern Alaska goes away, for example, that could be the only source of news that that community has. And these are the stations that are the most reliant on federal funding and will have the hardest time making up for that loss in funding from donations from their audience, for example.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating stuff. So speaking of things going away, we also chronicled the loss of jobs in newspapers over the arc of the last 20 years. 75% plus of newspaper jobs have vaporized in the last 20 years. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, 75% of newspaper jobs, it's around 260,000 jobs total. That includes 60% of newsroom positions, newspaper journalists and editors. Of course, the newspaper industry is broader than just their newsrooms. Some of the areas that have been the most heavily impacted have been production and distribution and back office management positions. And those have continued to slide. We saw a loss of 7% in the newspaper industry in this past year, again, between journalists, newsroom positions, between production and distribution, facility people. We saw a lot of folks lose their jobs when production plants went offline this past year. So this loss of journalism jobs, or I should say, this loss of newspaper jobs has continued unabated. And it's also continuing within journalism jobs writ large across all industries.
Yeah.
So oftentimes it's said, well, if newspaper jobs decline, they might be going up in other areas. But in this past year, we saw about a 7% decrease across the board for journalism jobs in all industries, in both newspapers and digital publishing.
So, and that ranks like right behind the makers of audio cassette tapes and the textile industry in terms of job loss,
It's
right?
about 4th in all of the industries tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in terms of the percentage of jobs lost.
Yeah, okay. So two other quick things. I also wanted to ask about something else we did new in the report this year, which is look at digital traffic to newspapers. We looked at traffic to the 100 of the largest newspapers across the country, and unfortunately the news there is not good either.
No, traffic to those 100 have decreased by about 40% over the last 4 years, which is a pretty staggering figure. Now, there's a couple caveats there. 2021 was perhaps an exceptional year in news. A lot of people were reading the news. A lot of people were going to news websites to understand what was going on with the pandemic, where could they go to get tested, what was the status of vaccinations. So there was a uptick in traffic that year. So we would expect kind of a slump from that peak, but perhaps not as dramatic as we've seen. And I think that there's been a couple of technological changes that have influenced that drop in traffic. One early one in 2022 was when Facebook de-emphasized links to local news. But I think a more recent and perhaps even more influential one has been the rise of generative AI in search, which basically means that when you search for a news outlet, regardless of the size of that news outlet, the headlines from that news outlet, the stories, the content, that's just presented to you in the search that's, again, gathered from that outlet's content, but presented in such a way where you don't need to go to that outlet to read that. And that is really impacting the traffic, the actual click-through traffic that's going to those sites. And
it also affects things like programmatic ad revenue, which is dependent on those people clicking into the news source for that information. So we're taping this right around Halloween, and what we've talked about is pretty scary up to this point. So, but there are some positive signs. in the 2025 State and Local News Report, including the growth of local news startups
Yep.
over the past 5 years, as well as the growth of network sites. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So over the past 5 years, we've seen more than 300 new local news startups. It's about 60 a year. And that's actually a pretty encouraging figure. 80% of those are digital-only sites, but that means that 20% of those are print newspapers, and it's a brave thing to do, perhaps, to start a print newspaper in 2025, but people are doing it and having success. The majority of these new startups are nonprofits. There are some for-profits that are starting up, but a lot more people are experimenting with the nonprofit model. And as you mentioned, there's also a lot more people experimenting with a network model of news. We've seen growth.
What can you explain the network model?
Sure. So, I mean, it can look different in a lot of different ways. We last year started to include network digital sites. These are sites like Patch or Axios that have smaller sites under a larger network umbrella. And the advantage behind this is that it effectively centralizes a lot of your back office tasks.
Right.
It effectively centralizes your tech stack, all of your back-end development. That's all kind of taken care of under an umbrella, leaving individual outlets responsible just for news and content generation. And we've seen this network model grow, certainly within the networks themselves. Axios has added several sites in the past year. But we've also seen this network model being adopted by more traditional news outlets. That's kind of foundational to places like the Post and Courier, who have spread
South Carolina,
in South
Charleston.
Carolina, have spread across South Carolina by putting news reporters in different parts of the state, but relying on sort of centralized back office support. We've seen that from Georges Media in Louisiana. We've seen that from Lookout Local across the West Coast. And we've also seen that, I mean, that's public radio's, NPR's kind of whole foundational model as well. So the network model of how can we expand our coverage, expand our content, but reduce our costs by centralizing some of our back office tasks, that's becoming increasingly popular across the U.S.
Yeah, okay. Zach, thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for that. Thank you for listening and being interested in the annual State and Local News Report. If you want more information, please feel free to go to the Medill Local News Initiative website, and you'll see this map on the homepage, along with all of the data on the local news landscape around the country. Thank you.
Thank you.